I fixed a teacher's broken mouse, but she complained I made her look bad when the kids found out it was actually a whiteboard eraser. This happened about 15 years ago when I worked at a primary and secondary school. I was happily typing away at my computer when a student knocked on the door to my basement office. "IT, Mrs. X can't get her mouse working." "Okay, let's go check it out." I quickly followed the student to Mrs. X's classroom. As soon as we walked in, Mrs. X greeted me with, "It's about time." Internally, I was already pissed off because I dropped everything the moment the student had come to get me. I didn't want to hear her complaints about being late. I tried to focus and get to her desk to assess the issue. Mrs. X had an Acer computer, a screen, and a projector. The mouse was wireless, so I figured it was probably a battery issue. She immediately started ranting as I approached her desk. "My smartboard isn't working, and it's costing me valuable teaching time. Your systems are terrible." I bit my tongue and nodded. I wanted to tell her to shut up, but I was used to this. Teachers would call me in, complain about being late, and then make me wait while they went on, which, of course, only delayed the fix. "Sorry to hear that," I said, trying to stay professional. I knew she'd be one of those who complained no matter what, so I didn't bother explaining that her last system upgrade had been 6 months ago. She'd either refuse to believe it or say it was too long ago. I looked at her desk and instantly saw the problem. The mouses we used were dark blue and wireless. Annoyingly, the whiteboard erasers were also dark blue. I knew exactly what had happened. She'd grabbed the wrong item, and it wasn't the mouse, it was the eraser. I quickly swapped the whiteboard eraser for a mouse and made sure to hide the swap from her and the students so she wouldn't look too bad. I then flipped the mouse over, turned it on, and put it back, ready to show her that it was working. "Fixed. Just needed to be turned off and on again," I said, proud of how quickly I'd solved the issue. But before I could even come up with an explanation, a student yelled out, "Mrs. X, you were using an eraser." And then, of course, all the kids started laughing. I tried to minimize the situation by saying, "I'm sorry, I tried my best to hide it." The room quieted down a bit, but the damage was done. I told Mrs. X that everything was fixed and that she could let me know if she needed any further help. She simply nodded and let me leave. I fixed a teacher's broken mouse, but she complained I made her look bad when the kids found out it was actually a whiteboard eraser. Part 2. I returned to my office and told my manager what had happened, thinking it was just a funny little blip. I even sent Mrs. X an email apologizing for not hiding the mouse swap better. I explained that it might have been funny, but I always try my best to protect staff from being laughed at by students. The next day, I came into work to find a meeting request from Mrs. X, the head of junior staff, and my manager. Turns out, Mrs. X had made a formal complaint about me making her look bad. My manager told me to refuse the meeting, and he would go in my place. I had no idea what was said in that meeting, but apparently, Mrs. X was furious. She had complained that instead of swapping out the mouse, I should have just gone and gotten a spare one to save her from looking bad. She said my actions undermined her authority in the classroom and ruined her credibility with the students and parents. Mrs. X was livid that my manager had stopped me from coming to the meeting. But my manager stood firm. He told her that if she pushed the issue any further, he'd happily take it up with the principal and explain how I tried my best to minimize her embarrassment. Ultimately, Mrs. X dropped the complaint. From that day forward, she was a lot friendlier toward me. However, I could tell she didn't really like me. It was clear that, in her mind, I hadn't done enough to cover up her mistake.